Welcome back! In this installment of Classics in a Nutshell, we'll be picking up from the Roman Republic government video. Now that you have a better idea of the republican system of government the Romans set up after they expelled the kings, it's time to find out how Rome went from a modest-sized city in central Italy to a major player on the ancient Mediterranean world stage in the 1st century BCE. But first, a little disclaimer. Since we obviously won't have time to cover everything that happened during the Roman Republic, we'll mainly be focusing on how Rome's expansion of territories led to the eventual collapse of the republican system of government, paving the way for the rise of an imperial system of government that reached its territorial zenith in 116 CE. So, let's get ready to rumble. As you know from our previous video, before Rome became a great empire, it started out as a small village, with its first leaders being kings. In particular, the Etruscan kings, starting with Tarquinius Priscus, ruled from 616 up to 510 BCE, up to the expulsion of Tarquinius Superbus. The rape of Lucretia by Sextus, son of Tarquinius Superbus, ostensibly led to a rebellion by a group of Roman aristocrats headed by Lucius Junius Brutus and Collatinus. The rebellion resulted in the expulsion of the Tarquin kings and the birth of the Roman Republic. A few Latin cities then joined together with Rome to overthrow the Etruscan rule and won a major victory at Aricia in 506 BCE. Rome then established a republic, governed by the Senate, with a pair of annually elected magistrates, known as the consuls, at its head. The Latin cities in Rome in particular were now politically independent. But back to Roman history. The victory at Aricia did not end Rome's troubles, as there remained other forces to contend with, such as the neighboring tribes of Latins and Samnites. Internally, there was also feuding between leading patrician families, as well as an emerging struggle between the patrician class and the plebeians. Luckily for the Romans, with regards to the latter conflict, after some years, the plebeians forced the Senate to pass a written series of laws that gave the plebeians their own representatives, the tribunes, which you'll remember from our video, Roman Republic in a Nutshell. With things somewhat more settled at home, Rome's ambitious expansion into Italy would now begin. The first great Roman military success was against its main rival in the salt trade, Veii. In 396 BCE, after a 10-year siege, the Romans captured the Etruscan city. Rome had taken its first step toward territorial expansion. Rome's next adversaries included her immediate neighbors to the east and south, the Aequi and Volsci. By the end of the 5th century BCE, they too had fallen under Roman control. Now, an unforeseen threat from the north was next on the horizon. Celtic peoples from Central Europe had been establishing themselves in northern Italy during the course of the 6th and 5th centuries, and in 391 BCE, a Celtic warband launched a raid deep into Etruria, defeating the Romans at the river Allia in 390 BCE, and even capturing and sacking their city. After this ignominious defeat, the Romans vowed never to let this happen again, and indeed, the city of Rome itself would not be captured again by a foreign invading force until its fall to the Goths nearly 8 centuries later. Remember those neighboring tribes surrounding Rome? Well, just because the Romans had managed to conquer some land doesn't mean they were done fighting. The Samnites and Latins were 2 more neighbors that Rome had to contend with as its own territories continued expanding. The First Samnite War was brief and inconclusive, but was followed by more significant Roman gains in the Second and Third Samnite Wars. In fact, victory in the Third Samnite War extended Roman territory across the Apennines to the Adriatic Sea. This now made Rome a major regional power and attracted hostile attention from some of the cities around the coast of southern Italy. These lands happened to have been settled earlier by Greek colonists. The Greeks, living in the south of the peninsula, therefore called in the help of Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, an ambitious adventurer who arrived at Tarentum in 280 BCE with a well-trained army, including something that really threw the Roman soldiers off: war elephants. He was eventually defeated, and Tarentum fell to the Romans in 272 BCE. So here's a fun fact. During this conflict, Pyrrhus had enjoyed some success against the Romans, partly thanks to the elephants, no doubt. But he suffered such heavy losses that they may as well have been considered defeats. This gave rise to the term we now refer to as a Pyrrhic victory. Rome now controlled most of the Italian peninsula, and as you can guess, other regional powers in the Mediterranean began to notice Rome's presence. One such power was Carthage, a city-state located in North Africa that, at the height of its power, was a major trading hub, with many outposts situated along trade routes of the Mediterranean. Amongst the territories under Carthaginian control was the island of Sicily. It will therefore come as no surprise that with Rome's growing ambitions, and with it seemingly geographically poised for expansion beyond the Italian peninsula, Roman interests were on their way to clashing with Carthaginian interests. Thus began the First Punic War. Now, since Sicily was an island, the Romans had to fight a number of naval battles. Rome, a traditionally land-based force, had to construct most of its fleet, and it's a testimony to Roman ingenuity that the rising city-state was able to add to its military arsenal by retro-engineering a Punic warship that had been found. A little side fun fact. For those of you who don't know, the Romans believed deeply in the gods and religious rituals. One such practice involved Roman generals consulting sacred chickens, yes, chickens, before important battles. In simple terms, they would consult the chickens about a specific question and then feed them. If the chickens ate, the answer meant yes, and if they didn't eat, then it meant no. During the First Punic War, the consul Publius Claudius Pulcher was said to have ignored an omen given by these sacred chickens when he asked them whether he should attack Carthage or not in a naval battle. The chickens wouldn't eat, so he decided to throw the chickens off his ship, saying, "If they will not eat, let them drink." Needless to say, the battle did not go very well for the Romans, and he was charged with treason. But let's get back to the war. After many years and a number of naval battles, the Romans finally managed to defeat the Carthaginians, and Sicily was reduced to the status of a Roman province, making it Rome's first overseas conquest. In the Second Punic War, the Carthaginians, led by Hannibal, struck back with an invasion of Italy itself. One of his most famous achievements was marching the Punic army, including war elephants, from Iberia, over the Pyrenees and the Alps, and into Italy. The Romans eventually won the war by mounting a counterattack on Carthaginian territory, forcing Hannibal to cross back to Africa to defend his homeland. He was defeated in the final battle at Zama in 202 BCE by the Roman general Scipio, who earned the nickname Africanus. The victory over Hannibal removed Carthage as a threat for now, but the conquest only brought about more clashes. In the west, in territories formerly controlled by Carthage, the Romans became involved in a succession of wars in Spain, as they sought to protect and expand their hold there. Closer to Italy, they renewed the conquest of the Celtic lands in the north, turning them into the province of Gallia Cisalpina. But the greatest wars of the 2nd century BCE were fought in the Balkans and in the eastern Mediterranean. Between the Second and still to come Third Punic Wars, Rome found itself embroiled in a series of conflicts to the east, notably against King Philip of Macedonia, but more on that in a moment. Most notably, in 146 BCE, in the Third Punic War, the Romans at last destroyed Carthage, turning its territory into a new Roman province, Africa. Things were indeed picking up in the expansion of Republican Rome. But how long could the Romans keep this up? It was said that Scipio Aemilianus, the general who orchestrated the destruction of Carthage, looked around the burning city and wept as he knew that his beloved Rome would one day suffer the same fate as this once glorious city. But, for the time being, Rome was on top, and it wasn't done expanding. After decisively defeating Macedonia and then capturing Corinth 2 decades later, Greece and Macedonia were officially added to Rome's list of conquered territories, becoming the Roman province of Achaia. Neighboring leaders took note, and in 133 BCE, rather than see his kingdom destroyed by war against the Romans, the king of Pergamum bypassed conflict and bequeathed his entire kingdom to Rome in his will. That's a lot of territorial expansion taking place in the last 2 centuries. Let's take a mini break from all that fighting and examine one interesting thing to come out of all this conflict. Remember how Rome had acquired the new province of Achaia that included Greece and Macedonia? Well, it was around this time that Romans started becoming more and more interested in Greek culture and all that its civilization had to offer. In particular, As the historians Ward, Heickelheim, and Yo point out, an aristocratic craze for things Greek expanded greatly during the period of overseas expansion, exposing the Romans to classical ideals, art, theater, and literature, as well as the emotional realism of the wider Hellenistic world. Though countless Greek treasures were no doubt plundered and brought to Rome, the Romans, in their own way, helped preserve, build upon, and disseminate many hallmarks of Greek civilization. The Roman poet Horace was even said to have quipped that captive Greece took her conqueror captive. But back to the Republic and its eventual decline. With more territories came more money, and with more money also came more problems. In fact, the next great conflict that Rome faced was not so much from foreign forces as it was from internal strife. We're going to try and simplify in a nutshell what was a highly complex mesh of socioeconomic factors, political turmoil, and historical events. If you'd like to find out more about the nitty-gritty details, feel free to check out Ward, Heickelheim, and Yo's A History of the Roman People. By the late 2nd century, wealthy landowners had begun to buy up and displace original peasant farmers who were no longer able to maintain their lands because they were all fighting as soldiers in regions that were increasingly farther and farther overseas. So, owing to an interesting quirk in Roman law, Roman citizens who did not own land were not only landless, but they were not even allowed to enlist in the army. As a result, many jobless and landless citizens returning from the war found themselves having to sell off their farms and began flocking to Rome, leading once again to a conflict between the rich and the poor, with the latter demanding reform. First on the scene, in a bid to sort out this turmoil, were the Gracchi brothers, who challenged the traditional constitutional order in the 130s and 120s BCE. Tiberius Gracchus, the guy on your left, tried to enact land reform that was aimed at breaking up large estates created out of public land and dividing them amongst landless Roman citizens. This land commission was designed to restore Roman military manpower, since with more Roman landowning citizens would come more Romans eligible for the army. Unfortunately, Tiberius himself was murdered. Next to take up the cause was Tiberius's brother Gaius Gracchus. Using the office of plebeian tribune as a means to wield almost absolute power, he restored powers to his brother's land commission, undertook an extensive road-building program, and passed a grain law designed to keep the price of grain at fixed amounts. Sort of like if the government were to pass a law keeping gas prices at a fixed amount. You can see how this law was designed to benefit the poor and did not curry favor with the rich. The patrician senators came to view the Gracchi brothers as public enemies, and Gaius too eventually met a violent end. Political attempts to wield power were becoming more complex with the turmoil at home and ongoing conflicts abroad. This led to a series of powerful Roman generals whose control of the Republic's military resources increasingly concentrated power in the hands of a select few. Gaius Marius was one of the first. Military commander, victorious general against King Jugurtha of Numidia, and hero who saved Italy from the invading Cimbrian Teutones, he reformed the Roman military, offering the voiceless, landless citizens an opportunity to join the army and reap the spoils of a military campaign, along with promises of retirement benefits such as land and money. This major shift in military policy, in essence, turned an army that was once considered a temporary one, raised when needed by the Republic for its defense, into a permanent and professional fighting force, offering opportunities for ordinary Romans to earn their pay as soldiers in a professional army. The masses flocked to join Marius in his new army, and as his success grew with each campaign, so too did the personal loyalty he enjoyed from his soldiers. So to whom did Romans now owe their loyalty? The Republic that commissioned them? Or the generals who looked after them day to day, their pay and their retirement? The conditions were ripe for unscrupulous commanders to use their armies for military and increasingly political gains. After Marius, Sulla was the next powerful commander to emerge. Having made his name in the Italian social wars and defeating King Mithridates of Pontus, he returned to Rome in 82 BCE, defeated all political opposition, and made himself dictator with absolute power. Now, although he eventually abdicated from his dictatorship, the political military genie had been let out of the bottle. Roman soldiers were starting to become more loyal to the generals who led them and promised them great payouts than to the republic that they were supposed to be serving. Following Sulla's death, Rome saw the emergence of Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, also known as Pompey the Great. Having served under Sulla, and with some military experience under his belt, he continued to build upon his success. With his father's wealth and the Senate's backing, Pompey raised an army and was handed the extraordinary command to rid the seas of pirates who were harrying Mediterranean shipping lanes from their Cilician strongholds in the east. And he didn't stop there. The great man was on a roll, adding the regions of Cilicia, Pontus, and Judea to Rome's territories. As you can see, by the 60s BCE, Rome had more than consolidated its hold on the majority of lands around the Mediterranean. Upon Pompey's return to Rome, he found himself face to face with two astute political opponents. In this corner we have Marcus Licinius Crassus, an immensely wealthy politician in search of military glory. And in the other corner we have Gaius Julius Caesar, a rising star out to make a name for himself. This set the stage for a political alliance known as the First Triumvirate. The three men, triumvirate, came together and were able to gather sufficient popular support to counter the Roman Senate and their political opponents. So whenever the Senate rejected some bills that they had sponsored, they worked together to have them passed. One of the most notable outcomes of this alliance was the fact that Caesar was able to get what he wanted, an opportunity to make a name for himself. Pompey and Crassus were content to control things in Rome, and they readily helped Caesar become consul. Then they helped him be appointed governor of two Gallic provinces, thus allowing him to embark on a campaign of conquest we now refer to as the Gallic Wars. This campaign resulted in a huge acquisition of new territories for Rome, not to mention immense wealth and glory for Caesar himself. And those soldiers who fought under Caesar, they served Rome, but their hearts belonged to their general, Caesar. With Gaul finally subjugated in 50 BCE, Caesar was now poised to realize his next ambition, the seizure of supreme power in Rome itself. The nutshell version of how things went from there is fairly straightforward. You see, Crassus had died a few years earlier on an overseas campaign, leaving Pompey solely in charge back in Rome. The senators, who had so opposed Pompey way back in 60 BCE, now flocked to him, wary of Caesar's rising power. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend and all that. And, with Pompey's support, the Senate ordered Caesar to disband his army and return to Rome. But, rather than allow his power to wane, Caesar took charge, and in 49 BCE, he did the unthinkable. He led his army of seasoned veterans across the Rubicon River into Italy, effectively declaring war on the Roman Senate, since no commander was allowed to take his soldiers outside his province without senatorial approval. He marched south to occupy Rome, while the senatorial party opposing him, led by Pompey, fled across the Adriatic to Dyrrhachium. On June 6, 48 BCE, Caesar won an overwhelming victory against Pompey at Pharsalus in Thrace, pursuing his former ally, now turned political enemy, to Alexandria in Egypt, only to find Pompey assassinated before he could meet and pardon him. With his characteristic speed and decisiveness, Caesar established Rome's presence in Egypt by deposing the pharaoh Ptolemy in favor of the latter's sister, Cleopatra, before heading home to Italy via the eastern provinces of Syria, Cilicia, Cappadocia, and Pontus. By the way, it was during one of these eastern campaigns at Sela where Caesar famously proclaimed in a letter the phrase, "Veni, vidi, vici," referring to a swift and decisive victory he had enjoyed. In February of 44 BCE, with his political opponents defeated and Rome firmly in his control, Caesar had himself appointed perpetual dictator. Many grumbled and feared that he had in essence made himself king of Rome. Now remember how Romans hated kings? Caesar's meteoric career and life famously ended with his assassination at Rome, ironically in the theater of Pompeii, on March 15, 44 BCE, at the hands of his fellow Roman senators, including Marcus Junius Brutus, descendant of the famous Lucius Junius Brutus, who had deposed the last of the Etruscan kings 6 centuries earlier. Connections across time. Yet another period of civil turmoil followed Caesar's assassination. Everyone thought that Caesar would naturally declare his lieutenant and right-hand man, Marcus Antonius, his successor. But to everyone's surprise, Caesar had made his adopted son Octavian his heir, thus bequeathing to him an immense patrimony and all his clients. The two men here formed an alliance and managed to defeat Caesar's assassins Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. They then established what's called the Second Triumvirate, joining forces with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus. The three men decided to divide power and the Roman territories between them, with Octavian looking after Rome in the west, Mark Antony in charge of the east, including Egypt, and Lepidus in charge of Africa. But Lepidus' part in all of this was short-lived. After an unsuccessful rebellion, he was stripped of his power by Octavian. Now Octavian's main rival was Mark Antony. You see, before departing for Egypt, Antony had sealed his alliance with Octavian by marrying the latter's sister Octavia. But once in Egypt, he met Cleopatra, and the two quickly engaged in a love affair, immortalized by Shakespeare in his play Antony and Cleopatra. That was just what Octavian needed to stir up Roman sentiments in his favor. Mark Antony, he claimed, had fallen under the influence of Cleopatra, and it was up to him to save Mark Antony, and along with him, Rome's interests in the East, by declaring war on Cleopatra. In 32 BCE, Octavian declared war on Cleopatra. The final sea battle was fought on September 2nd, 31 BCE at Actium, with Octavian carrying the day. Antony and Cleopatra fled, and both would eventually commit suicide. Octavian's victory at the Battle of Actium left him solely in charge of Rome's vast territories, and in 27 BCE the Senate granted him the title Augustus, in effect making him Emperor of Rome. Sidebar, some scholars considered Caesar the first unofficial emperor of Rome, but for the sake of simplicity in this Classics in a Nutshell episode, we'll consider it Augustus. Unlike Caesar, who had attempted to seize power by operating outside the bounds of the Roman constitution, Augustus learned from Caesar's mistakes and made sure to operate within the republican system, even if only nominally. He set about a series of reforms designed to consolidate his power, including establishing overall control of the army, establishing control of important provinces, establishing frontiers, fixing pay for the army, obtaining the right to veto any legislation that was proposed, sitting alongside elected consuls, aggrandizing Rome with constructive projects, dredging and widening the Tiber River, seizing control of the war and dole, religious reform, social reform, including divorce laws. All this was orchestrated and, according to many scholars, complemented by a program of propaganda that included the building of monuments, public buildings, statues, and even patronizing the arts. The result of all of Augustus's careful and crafty efforts was a concentration of most of the power in the hands of one person, and this effectively brought an end to the republican system of government that had served Rome for the past 5 centuries. The Principate had begun, and Rome was now seeing the birth of an empire. Thanks for joining us for this latest edition of Classics in a Nutshell, and we hope you'll tune in next time.